The cold metal of the keys feels heavy in my pocket as my daughter-in-law storms toward me, fury in her eyes. Still, I don't flinch, letting the silence stretch between us. As her hand swings, the slap lands, but it doesn't break me, just a fleeting sting. While she rages, I calmly slip the key from my pocket, watching her face twist in disbelief. That's when it hits me. She thought she could control me, but she never had the power. The house is mine, and she'll never take it from me again. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Ruth stepped lightly into the hallway, the morning sun filtering through the kitchen blinds, casting soft lines across the tiles. Her purse hung loosely in her hand, the keys already tucked into her coat pocket. It was just a routine trip. Groceries, some bread, eggs, nothing more than that. But as she reached for the front door, she stopped. Jenna stood in the doorway to the living room, blocking her path. "Where are the keys, Ruth?" Jenna's voice was sharp, like the crack of a whip. She didn't even try to hide the anger on her face. Eyes narrowed, lips tight. Her hand was outstretched, fingers stiff. Ruth could feel the pulse of tension in the air, but she didn't flinch. Ruth's gaze met her daughter-in-law's. Calm, even. "You don't need them anymore." A beat of silence, and then it happened. Jenna's hand shot out so fast Ruth barely had time to react. The slap landed hard against her cheek, the sting of it sharp and sudden. Ruth's head jerked to the side, her skin burning. The sound of the impact, loud and unforgiving, seemed to hang in the air for a moment longer than it should. Jenna froze, her breath shallow. She stared at Ruth, wide-eyed, as if she couldn't quite comprehend what she'd just done. Ruth's fingers lingered at her cheek, the sharpness still cutting through the air. She didn't move, didn't say a word. Her expression remained unreadable, the weight of years lived in this house, in this life, anchoring her to the moment. The slap wasn't unexpected. She had felt the tension, seen the signs. But it wasn't the slap that mattered. It was what came next. "Mom!" Katie's voice rang out from the stairwell above, high and piercing, filled with the rawness of shock. Ruth didn't turn. She didn't need to. She could hear the footsteps coming down the stairs, fast, frantic. As Katie's voice stumbled over words. "What the hell?" Jenna took a half step back, her lips trembling with the realization of what she'd just done. Her face twisted, a flicker of panic dancing across her features. She glanced at the door, as if she could escape the moment by simply retreating, but there was nowhere to go. Mason's voice cut through the tension, soft but firm. "Let's all calm down." His words hung in the space between them, half-hearted and too late. He appeared in the doorway just in time to see the aftermath, his eyes darting between Jenna and Ruth. His hand brushed through his hair, the movement too casual for the storm brewing. Ruth could see it in his eyes. He wasn't going to step in. Not yet. Not in any meaningful way. Katie's feet hit the floor with a heavy thud as she reached the bottom of the stairs. Her face pale, eyes wide. She looked at Ruth first, her expression filled with disbelief, then at Jenna, who was still standing too close to the door, her hand shaking slightly at her side. "Are you all right?" Katie asked Ruth, her voice barely above a whisper. But her eyes weren't just asking about the slap. They were asking if Ruth was going to let it slide. Asking if this was the moment Ruth would finally snap. But Ruth didn't answer her directly. She didn't need to. Mason looked at Jenna, his voice softer now, more pleading. "Jenna, what the hell? What did you do?" But Jenna, now breathing heavily, seemed oblivious to his question, still fixated on Ruth. Her chest heaved, as if the fury had drained out of her the moment she realized the depth of her own action. For the first time, Ruth saw it. Guilt. or something close to it, creeping into her expression. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Ruth straightened her shoulders and turned her gaze back to Jenna, her voice steady, unwavering. You should have thought about that before. Katie's eyes darted back and forth, between Ruth and the two of them, searching for something. An answer. A sign that everything would go back to normal. But Ruth didn't offer her any reassurance. She didn't need to. Instead, Ruth placed a hand on the door, her fingers grazing the cool brass handle. She wasn't moving yet, wasn't rushing. She simply stood there letting the silence stretch between them. Jenna was still frozen, her body tense, as if waiting for Ruth to say something more, something to validate what had just happened. But Ruth didn't. Not yet. Ruth knew, in that moment, the power of quiet. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any words ever could. Katie's hand brushed against Ruth's arm. Her touch was gentle, but it carried an undercurrent of something more. Fury, maybe, or defiance. Ruth let her fingers rest against Katie's. She didn't need to say it. Katie understood. The silence said it all. The door clicked softly behind her as Ruth stepped outside, leaving the confrontation and Jenna's slap behind. But the story was far from over. 2 days earlier, Ruth had walked into the locksmith's office with a folder tucked under her arm. The morning sun was hidden behind the dense fog that clung to Sacramento's suburban streets, giving the neighborhood a still, muted feel. She didn't mind it. It suited her mood. Quiet. Deliberate. Ruth wasn't a woman of drama or impulse. She never had been. But this was different. The locksmith, a man in his early 50s with weathered hands and a wary look in his eyes, glanced at her as she entered. His shop was small, cluttered with tools and boxes of locks, most of which were far too ordinary for the purpose she had in mind. "Afternoon," he said gruffly. His voice was low, measured. Ruth gave him a brief nod and placed the folder on the counter between them. She didn't bother with pleasantries. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The deed to her house was right there. And when she slid it across to him, the silence that followed held an unspoken understanding. This wasn't about replacing a lost key or upgrading a security system. This was a quiet exchange. Ruth wasn't here for small talk. She was here to do what needed to be done. She handed him her ID, then watched as he studied the paperwork. His eyes flicked between the deed and the list of tasks she'd prepared. 3 locks and a keypad to be replaced. He seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation in her calmness, in the precision of her request. "You'll be able to do this today?" Ruth asked, her voice even. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "Sure," he said, his fingers already moving to grab his tools. "Shouldn't take long. Want to keep the old locks?" "No," she said, without hesitation. "Dispose of them." The locksmith gave her a look, a fleeting flash of curiosity, and then he nodded, retreating into the back of the shop to gather what he needed. Ruth remained still, her hands folded in her lap. The soft hum of the shop's lights buzzed in the background, and for a moment it felt like the whole world had paused. She didn't mind the stillness. It was exactly what she needed. Minutes later, they were back at her house. The locksmith worked quickly, his movements deliberate but not rushed. Ruth stood by the front door, arms crossed, watching him as he worked. The familiar hum of the drill, the click of metal against metal was oddly soothing. She wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. Anger wasn't something Ruth had time for. What she felt was something far colder, far more certain. "Everything all right in there?" Katie's voice interrupted her thoughts. Ruth turned to find her granddaughter standing in the doorway, a curious frown etched across her face. Ruth smiled faintly. "It's fine, sweetheart. Just making a few changes." Katie didn't ask any more questions, but Ruth saw the glint of understanding in her eyes. Katie, though quiet and reserved, had always been perceptive. She knew that Ruth didn't do things lightly. The way she was handling this, it was calculated, deliberate. Katie joined her by the door as the locksmith finished with the last of the exterior locks. His tools were carefully laid out on the ground, the task completed with exacting care. "Done," the locksmith muttered, dusting his hands off. "That's all 3 locks and the keypad. You're set." Ruth handed him an envelope with the agreed-upon payment. He didn't count the cash. Didn't need to. They both knew what was happening. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "And dispose of the old locks as promised." He gave her a nod, then turned to leave, his boots making soft sounds as he disappeared through the gate. The moment the door closed behind him, Ruth stood for a moment, her gaze lingering on the now secure locks. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the keys one by one, slipping them into her purse with a practiced hand. Katie stood beside her, looking up at her grandmother. "What's next?" Ruth paused for a beat, then glanced down at Katie. She reached into her purse and pulled out one of the new keys, placing it into Katie's palm. "For you," Ruth said, her voice low and steady. "You'll be the only one who still has a key to this house." Katie's fingers curled around the small metal object, her gaze lifting to meet Ruth's. No words were necessary. Ruth wasn't saying this to hurt anyone. She was saying it because she could. Because it was time. And for the first time in weeks, Ruth felt something akin to peace. The keys, the locks, the house. It was all hers now. And it would stay that way. Later, as Ruth and Katie moved through the house, their movements synchronized. They took their time, together, deleting the old key codes from the smart system. Ruth's hands were steady as she typed, but the quiet satisfaction in her chest told her that everything was already falling into place. Once everything was in order, Ruth walked over to the fireproof box tucked away in the back of her closet. She placed one of the new keys inside it, sealed it tight, and locked it. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of security, not just in the locks, but in the choices she'd made. But there was still something left to do. There always was. And the silence in the house now seemed louder than ever. The guest suite was quiet when Ruth opened the door. There was no sound, no drama, just the hum of the air conditioning and the soft glow of late afternoon light filtering through the blinds. It had always been Jenna's space when she and Mason visited. A place where her daughter-in-law would stash her things, where her things would take over, little by little, until the room felt more like Jenna's than Ruth's. But not anymore. Ruth stood in the doorway for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. Pillows tossed carelessly on the bed, a glass of wine left half drunk on the nightstand, magazines stacked haphazardly on the dresser. In some ways, it felt like it had always been like this. The clutter. The sense that someone was living here, just out of sight. But not anymore. She moved methodically, pulling open the closet doors with a soft click. The clothes were neat, everything folded in a way that suggested order. Control? Ruth ran her fingers over the fabrics. Expensive silk blouses, brand-name jackets, the kind of clothes that screamed luxury, a life she had never asked for, but had learned to tolerate. She folded them with care, stacking them in a large cardboard box labeled "Return to Sender." It wasn't anger that made her do it. It was necessity. Jenna had overstepped. She had tried to claim something that wasn't hers. And Ruth, well, she wasn't the type to ask twice. She took what was hers and made sure it stayed that way. On the nightstand, she found what she was looking for, a bottle of wine labeled "Private Stash." Jenna had always kept it hidden, tucked away in the back corner of the guest room, behind a stack of books. Ruth's fingers grazed the cool glass, her thumb brushing over the label. She didn't open it. didn't have to. The wine wasn't the point. It was the fact that it had been kept in the shadows, something just out of reach. Ruth placed the bottle carefully into the box, her hands steady. Each item she added, an expensive yoga mat, a pair of designer sneakers, a makeup bag that smelled faintly of perfume, went in with the same precision. Everything had a place, even if that place wasn't in Ruth's home anymore. She stepped back for a moment, eyeing the room. It felt different now. The air, thick with the scent of expensive lotions and perfume, felt lighter somehow. There was nothing left to claim here. No more small, quiet intrusions that had once filled the space with a kind of uncomfortable familiarity. Now, there was only what was hers. Katie stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face a careful mix of concern and curiosity. Ruth looked up, meeting her granddaughter's gaze. Katie had been watching her for a while now, observing the way she moved, the way she didn't hesitate. Ruth could feel the question hovering between them. Want help? Katie's voice was quiet, tentative. Ruth paused. She hadn't asked for help, she hadn't needed it. But there was something in Katie's expression, a willingness, an understanding. Ruth gave a small nod. Yes, she said, her voice low but steady. Help me get these to the garage. Katie stepped into the room, walking over to the boxes. She didn't need to ask what was inside. She knew. She picked up the first one without hesitation, carrying it easily across the room as if it were nothing. Ruth followed, lifting the next box. Together, they moved in a kind of quiet synchronicity, each step an unspoken agreement. When they reached the garage, Ruth placed the boxes under the camera in the corner, careful to arrange them just so. Each one had been labeled, each one had its place. Documentation was important, proof that nothing had been overlooked, nothing left behind. She knew that once this was done, there would be no turning back. Katie stood beside her, looking down at the boxes, her fingers trailing over the top of one. You think they'll notice? She asked, her voice low. Ruth didn't look at her. She didn't need to. She knew what Katie meant. She knew what they were really asking. It wasn't about the stuff. It wasn't even about the eviction. It was about the shift, the change, the feeling that this was no longer just a house. It was a battleground, and Ruth had drawn the lines. They'll notice, Ruth said, her voice as calm as it had been when she changed the locks. But it won't matter. Katie didn't respond. Instead, she just nodded and stepped back, giving Ruth space. There was something in her eyes, something that said she understood this was bigger than both of them. Bigger than the house, the belongings, even the slap. This was about something Ruth had never truly let go of. Control. Ruth moved to the desk in the corner of the garage, pulling out a stack of blank paper. She printed a list of everything she'd packed. The makeup, the yoga gear, the wine, every last detail. She added the date, signed it, then slipped the list into the folder she had kept hidden away. The paperwork was meticulous, necessary. The small details were what would matter in the end. But there was one last thing to do. Ruth stepped back, her eyes scanning the boxes once more. She had cleared the room. But she hadn't cleared it all. There was something still left behind. Something that would make everything feel final. And as she turned to leave the garage, she knew it would be her next move that would silence any doubt. The silence was rich now, earned. And she could almost hear the distant footsteps of Jenna, the echo of her fury, just on the other side of the door. It wouldn't be long before she came looking for what Ruth had taken. But by then, it would be too late. The coffee shop was small, tucked into the corner of a strip mall that hadn't seen any significant change in decades. The kind of place where the barista knew your name, and the air was thick with the smell of espresso and cinnamon rolls. Ruth was early, as usual, She had already chosen a corner booth, the one that faced the door, allowing her to watch people come and go with ease. It was a habit she'd developed over the years, never letting her guard down, never fully surprised by who might walk in. Darla was punctual too, though Ruth knew her to be the type who never arrived early, but always on time. The woman had a no-nonsense air about her, a lawyer who had seen more than her share of messy family affairs, the kind of lawyer Ruth needed. When Darla walked in, she was exactly as Ruth remembered. Sharp, poised, with that slight edge of exhaustion around her eyes that only came from years of dealing with people who didn't understand the cost of the fight they were picking. She took one look at Ruth and slid into the seat across from her without any greeting. They didn't need pleasantries. Ruth set the folder in front of Darla, her movements deliberate, as if each action was part of a larger plan. The manila folder was thick, stuffed with papers. Ruth hadn't been sure what she was going to do when she first walked into Darla's office, but now that she was here, it all felt clear. She had been living with uncertainty for far too long, and it was time to fix that. Darla flipped the folder open without hesitation, scanning the documents inside. Ruth watched her, patient, steady, but inside, her pulse quickened. This was the moment when things would become real. Deed to the house. Proof of ownership, Darla mumbled, glancing up at Ruth. And this. She paused as she reached the last piece of paper. Home security footage from the day Jenna slapped you. This is all you have? Ruth didn't flinch. It's enough. Darla looked at her for a long moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. Do you want a restraining order? She asked. It was a simple question, but Ruth could feel the weight behind it. A restraining order would be the obvious step, the thing that could make all the drama go away, give Ruth some breathing room. But Ruth had already made up her mind. No, Ruth said quietly. Not yet. Darla raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Then what do you want? Ruth took a slow breath, leaning in slightly, the weight of her words hanging between them. I want a formal eviction, a revocation of residence rights. Darla sat back, her fingers tapping the table as she absorbed the request. Ruth could see her mind working, calculating, weighing the pros and cons. Darla wasn't one to rush into things, especially when it involved family drama. Eviction wasn't something to take lightly, but Ruth didn't want revenge. Not in the way people might think. She wasn't after the satisfaction of seeing Jenna suffer. She didn't need that. I want my house back, Ruth added, her voice steady, even. I don't want to fight. I just want them gone. Darla nodded slowly, absorbing Ruth's words with the quiet respect Ruth had come to expect from her. I'll begin drafting the paperwork. This could take a few weeks, depending on the court's schedule. I'll need all the documentation you can gather. Anything else you want to add? Ruth thought for a moment. No, she said, her voice steady. Just get it done. Darla didn't argue, didn't question her further. Instead, she started scribbling notes, outlining the steps they'd need to take. Ruth watched her, calm, collected. She wasn't looking for validation. She wasn't asking for approval. This was the path she had chosen, and she would walk it with the same quiet determination she always had. As Darla stood to leave, she gave Ruth a look, almost like a silent acknowledgement. There was no comfort to be had here, no promises that everything would work out. Just the quiet understanding that Ruth was doing what she needed to do. But as Darla moved toward the door, Ruth's gaze followed her, her fingers tightening around the edge of her cup. There was something else stirring now, a sense of finality. The lines had been drawn, the battle was set, and there was no turning back. Ruth glanced at the clock. She had plenty of time before the next move needed to be made, but somehow everything felt immediate now. The silence that followed Darla's departure wasn't comforting. It was the silence of something irreversible. And then, just as the door to the coffee shop swung open, Ruth stood. She had come here for a reason, and now that reason was set in motion. The first step had been taken. The house was hers again, and soon, Jenna would know it. But Ruth wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The courthouse was exactly what Ruth had expected. A tired, gray building tucked among more modern structures, yet still carrying the weight of decades' worth of cases. Small battles, big ones, but all fighting for some kind of justice. Ruth walked in through the heavy automatic doors, the scent of paper and old wood mingling in the air. She had been here before, years ago, when life had been easier, quieter. But today, she was here for something else. Something much more final. Her footsteps echoed on the linoleum floors as she made her way to the county clerk's office. There was no hesitation in her stride, no second guessing. Her fingers brushed the edge of the folder she held tightly against her side. Inside was the official notice of revocation and eviction, the paperwork that would change everything. Ruth didn't waste time with small talk. She handed the folder to the clerk at the counter, a young woman with a bored look on her face, no older than Ruth's granddaughter. She barely looked up as Ruth placed the envelope in front of her. Ruth watched as the clerk took the papers, her nails clicking against the metal clasp of the folder. The young woman skimmed the top sheet, then looked up, meeting Ruth's steady gaze. "This for an eviction?" the clerk asked, a hint of judgment in her voice. Ruth didn't flinch. "Yes." The clerk's eyes flicked to the bottom of the page, where the 30-day notice was stamped in bold. She handed Ruth the papers and said, "You'll need to pay the expedited filing fee." Ruth nodded, slipping a wad of cash from her purse. It wasn't much, just enough to push the process along, to make sure this wasn't delayed by bureaucracy. The crisp bills landed on the counter, and the clerk hesitated only briefly before taking them. Without another word, the clerk typed something into the computer. Ruth could hear the faint click of keys, the soft buzz of a printer as the transaction was processed. The machine spat out a receipt, which the clerk slid across the counter. Ruth picked it up, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper, and placed it in her bag. As the clerk prepared to file the documents, Ruth's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. This moment had been a long time coming, and nothing would distract her now. "Anything else?" the clerk asked, breaking Ruth's train of thought. Ruth's voice was even, though a part of her felt a deep sense of finality settling in her chest. "I need a police escort for delivery, to make sure it's served." The clerk paused, glancing over at her supervisor, who nodded imperceptibly. Ruth could see the wheels turning in the clerk's mind. A police escort wasn't typical for an eviction notice, but Ruth wasn't typical. Ruth had learned long ago that some battles needed a little extra assurance to make them stick. "All right," the clerk said, sliding the file toward Ruth. "I'll request an officer. Shouldn't take long." Ruth took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands. Real, tangible. This was happening. There was no going back. She could almost hear the hum of the air conditioning in the otherwise quiet room, the soft rustling of paper around her, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Ruth turned and walked toward the door, her heels tapping softly against the floor. She paused just before stepping outside, her eyes landing on her granddaughter Katie, sitting on a bench just outside the courthouse. She was sipping a smoothie, her legs crossed in that way she always did when she was relaxed, something Ruth couldn't help but admire. Katie looked up and smiled as Ruth approached. There was a lightness to her expression, a quiet pride that mirrored Ruth's own. The girl had been by her side through so much, even if she hadn't fully understood all of it. But Ruth knew that Katie saw the change, the shift in the air. Ruth didn't need to explain anything. She simply handed Katie the manila envelope. Katie took it without question, her fingers brushing Ruth's. "Don't open this unless they lie again," Ruth said, her voice firm but laced with something softer. A warning, and yet an unspoken trust. Katie's eyes softened as she nodded, her lips curving into a knowing smile. "I won't." Ruth's gaze lingered on her granddaughter for a moment, taking in the way she was holding herself. The confidence, the quiet understanding between them. It was the same unspoken connection they had always shared. Ruth didn't need to say anything more. Katie understood what needed to be done. Ruth turned back toward the courthouse doors, stepping outside into the warm afternoon light. The day was unfolding exactly as she had planned. No interruptions, no questions, just the calm certainty of knowing that, soon, everything would be in its place. She was almost to her car when the sound of footsteps approached. Ruth's heart skipped for a moment, then steadied. She didn't look back. Instead, she reached for her phone and pressed the button to bring up the security footage, just to be sure. It was something small, something careful, but it felt necessary. As the video loaded, Ruth let the faintest smile tug at the corners of her lips. They would know soon, and when they did, it would be too late. The morning had a chill to it, the kind that made the sun seem far away even though it was already high in the sky. Ruth stood at the edge of her driveway, her hands folded behind her back, watching as Officer Lane's car pulled up in front of the house. The car's lights blinked softly, signaling his arrival, though Ruth hadn't asked for attention. Not yet. She didn't need to be there for what was about to happen, but somehow, standing here felt necessary. It was part of the last step, the quiet moment before everything she'd been working toward fell into place. She could see the house behind her, its wide windows reflecting the sunlight. Her house. Her home. The place where everything started. Where it would end. Officer Lane stepped out of the car, a tall, steady figure with the kind of calm demeanor that Ruth appreciated. She had known him from neighborhood watch meetings, always calm under pressure. He never rushed, never showed too much emotion. His job was just a job, and that's how Ruth liked it. He walked up to the front door, his shoes making a soft, rhythmic tap on the pavement, and knocked. It was a simple knock, 2 short, deliberate taps, but it felt as if the entire neighborhood could hear it. Inside, Ruth could already sense the tension building. She hadn't seen Jenna or Mason yet today, but she knew they were inside. It had only been a matter of time before they realized the paperwork was coming, before they understood what was happening. Jenna opened the door, her face tight, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "What's this about?" Jenna's voice was sharp, too tight for a simple greeting. She had that look on her face, the look of someone who thought they could control everything. And now, with one small shift, it was slipping through their fingers. Officer Lane didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the official notice, holding it out to her without ceremony. "Ma'am, this is a legal notice of change of residence rights," he said in his usual even tone. "You and your husband are no longer legally allowed to reside in this property." Jenna blinked twice, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. She took a step back, her hands trembling at her sides, but her pride still held her posture upright. "What the hell?" Her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. "She can't do this. This is our house." Officer Lane's voice remained calm, unfazed by the outburst. "Not according to the county records, ma'am." Jenna's eyes flicked from Officer Lane to the document in his hand, and Ruth could see the flush of color rising in her daughter-in-law's cheeks. Jenna stepped forward, her hands reaching out as if to snatch the paper away from Officer Lane's grip, but the officer didn't flinch. "This is a mistake," Jenna snapped, now practically shouting. "This isn't right, Mason!" Jenna turned sharply, her voice now a high-pitched shriek that echoed down the hallway. "Mason, get down here, now!" The sound of footsteps above them signaled that Mason had finally heard the commotion. His face appeared in the doorway a few moments later, his expression as confused as it was tense. He was still wearing a shirt from the night before, untucked, his eyes squinting as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" Mason asked, his voice hoarse from just waking up. But he didn't need to ask. Officer Lane cleared his throat, turning slightly to face Mason. "I'm serving your family a legal notice, sir. A notice of revocation of residence rights. You and your wife are no longer allowed to reside here." Ruth stood behind the officer now, just far enough back that she wasn't in his direct line of sight. She watched the entire exchange with quiet satisfaction, her face unreadable. She hadn't expected any other outcome. Not this moment. Not the words that had finally left her mouth and become reality. Katie stood on the porch, a few steps behind Ruth, her phone in hand. Ruth had caught the look on Katie's face when the door had opened, but the girl didn't say a word. She just raised the camera and began filming. The way Jenna exploded was something Ruth would need. Something important for the next step. Proof of what was coming. Of what had been happening in the shadows for far too long. Mason was looking between Officer Lane and Jenna now, still not fully grasping what was going on. Is this really happening?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly as if trying to bargain with reality. Jenna turned on him, her face twisted in fury. "You need to fix this. She's taking everything. She can't just take the house, Mason. We're supposed to be family." But Mason didn't respond. His eyes were wide, his face pale. For the first time, Ruth saw him truly unsure of what to do, and it wasn't that it brought her any pleasure. It was more the simple realization that this was what he had been avoiding all along, the inevitable moment when he would have to pick a side. Jenna, still fuming, reached out again to grab the notice from Officer Lane. "This is our house," she hissed, her fingers trembling in the air, but the officer stepped back, holding the paper just out of reach. "This is the law, ma'am," Officer Lane said, his voice still calm, but there was no mistaking the finality in his tone. "You have 30 days to vacate, and the sheriff's department will be in touch if you do not comply." Ruth didn't need to say a word. She didn't have to move. Everything was falling into place. Jenna's hands curled into fists, but Ruth saw something else in her eyes now, a fear that hadn't been there before. That was the moment Ruth had been waiting for, when Jenna knew, deep down, there was nothing left to do but accept it. Katie's phone clicked softly as the video continued to roll, and Ruth, standing silent and steady behind Officer Lane, finally allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The steak sizzled in the pan, its rich aroma filling the kitchen as Ruth carefully turned it, the sound of it crackling under the heat. She didn't rush. There was no need to. She had learned over the years that good things, things worth keeping, took time. The red wine sat in a glass beside her, half full, its deep color catching the light from the soft kitchen lamps. The music playing in the background, some smooth jazz, quiet and unintrusive, seemed to underscore the calm of the evening. She glanced over at the clock, noting that it was just past 7. Too early for dinner, perhaps, but it felt right. After the storm had passed, after the chaos of the day, this quiet, this stillness, felt like an indulgence. Ruth had always taken solace in routine, in the quiet hum of ordinary moments, and tonight, she was holding on to that routine like it was a shield. Upstairs, though, the storm hadn't passed. Jenna's rage was a thunderstorm, a constant slam of doors. The sound of things being tossed around, furniture perhaps, or maybe just her own fury, her frustration. Ruth could hear it all, the thud of a door, the muffled sound of shouting. It didn't bother her. Not really. Mason was pacing. She could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if he was trying to convince himself that this was all just a misunderstanding. But Ruth knew better. There was no misunderstanding here. Not anymore. The moment had arrived, and there was no taking it back. Not for him. Not for Jenna. Not for any of them. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind startled her, and she turned to find Katie entering the kitchen, her face a study of calm determination. The girl had an air about her now, quietly defiant, but steady, as if she had seen enough to understand that this was what needed to happen. Ruth watched her for a moment as Katie pulled out the chair and sat down at the table. "Steak?" Ruth asked, her voice almost too light, as though nothing had happened in the last few hours, as if the world hadn't shifted around them. Katie nodded, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks," Katie said softly. "I'm not hungry. Just sitting." Ruth turned back to the stove, moving with the kind of precision that came from years of repetition. The steak was perfect now, the edges brown and crisp. She plated it, pouring a small measure of wine into Katie's glass before doing the same for herself. The silence between them settled easily, comfortable in a way it hadn't been in years. Katie picked up her fork, twirling it in her hand, as if waiting for something. "You're really doing it, huh?" Katie's voice was quieter than usual, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't asking out of concern. It was more of an observation, a realization. Ruth didn't look up from the plate she was setting before her. "I already did." Katie's gaze lingered on her fingers pausing midair, the fork hovering over the food. Ruth didn't have to explain, and Katie didn't need more words. The understanding was there, as it always had been. But the quiet was interrupted when Mason's voice echoed down the hallway, soft but insistent. "Mom, Ruth, please, let's just talk for a second." Ruth's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't move. The door to the kitchen remained open, and she could hear him pacing, back and forth, each step like a tick of the clock. Urgent, but not without a hint of desperation. Katie didn't react, but Ruth could feel the tension building. Mason's voice came again, this time more pleading. "This isn't the way to handle it. You're overreacting. We're family." Ruth didn't look toward the door. She didn't need to. "Too little, too late," she said, her voice low but resolute, cutting through the air like the knife through the steak she had just prepared. She heard him stop, his footsteps coming to an abrupt halt, as if he were rethinking everything. Ruth didn't give him time to change his mind. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the spare key. The cool metal felt smooth in her hand as she slid it across the table, her fingers barely brushing Katie's as she placed it in front of her. Katie picked it up, her fingers curling around the key, the gesture small but significant. "Only you," Ruth said, her voice steady. "You're the only one who will have a key to this house." Katie's expression softened as she held the key, her grip firm around it as if she were anchoring herself to something solid, something she understood. Ruth's gaze lingered for a moment longer, then she picked up her glass of wine and took a sip, allowing the warmth to settle in her chest. There was no regret, no second-guessing. There was just the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing that this was what had to happen. Mason's voice filtered in again from the hallway, now quieter, almost defeated. But Ruth didn't move. She didn't need to. The decision had been made. The house was hers. And soon, the past would be nothing more than a shadow on the wall. "Do you think he'll ever understand?" Katie asked quietly, looking at Ruth, the key still in her hand. Ruth met her gaze, her eyes steady. "Maybe. But it won't matter. Not anymore." And as they sat in the quiet of the kitchen, with the sounds of Mason's distant pacing echoing through the house, Ruth felt the weight of the past lifting. The world outside could rage, could scream, and demand answers. But Ruth knew, finally, that the answers were hers to give. And she had already given them. Ruth sat at her desk, the hum of the computer the only sound in the otherwise still room. She hadn't been able to get the security footage out of her mind since the moment Jenna had slapped her. It had felt, in that instant, like everything had shifted, like the house she'd built and the family she'd raised had finally come undone. But now, in the quiet aftermath, Ruth understood the power of what she'd captured. It wasn't just the slap. It was everything. The moment Jenna's mask slipped, the fury that had been building up for years, and Ruth's own silent resolve. The video footage was still stored on the system, tucked away in the archives, but it wasn't enough for Ruth to just watch it again. She knew the importance of it, knew it would matter down the road. So, she logged into the cloud, her fingers moving swiftly as she uploaded the file. The timestamp was clear, precise, a record of everything: the slap, the tension, the moment everything changed. She clicked upload and leaned back in her chair, watching the progress bar move slowly across the screen. A few moments later, it was done. Ruth didn't pause. She knew this part, this documentation, was necessary. She opened a new folder on the desktop, one labeled Legal Defense. With a few quick keystrokes, she attached the footage to an email and sent it to Darla. Darla's reply was almost immediate, a simple, professional acknowledgement. "I'll take it from here," she had written. "We'll need the verbal threats as well." Ruth had expected this. Darla, ever pragmatic, understood the gravity of what Ruth had captured. The slap wasn't enough, at least not legally. It needed context, and that context was in the words that had been exchanged just before. Ruth clicked back to the security footage, scrolling to the moment just after the slap when Jenna had yelled, the venom in her words unmistakable. Ruth paused the video at the perfect frame, Jenna's face twisted in rage, her mouth wide as she hurled threats and insults that would make any lawyer's job easier. She took a screenshot, the timestamp clear and precise. Once the image was saved, Ruth attached it to the same email with a note: "For legal use, timestamped for evidence." Her heart beat steadily in her chest, no hesitation. This wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring she had everything in place, just in case. Ruth had been through enough in her life to understand that in moments like this, precision was everything. She exhaled slowly and turned her attention to Katie, who had been silently watching from the doorway. Ruth didn't need to look up to know her granddaughter was there, the quiet presence something Ruth had come to rely on. "Got it all covered," Ruth said, her voice calm, controlled. Katie nodded, her eyes flicking between the screen and her grandmother's face. "I emailed myself a backup," Katie added, her voice steady, mature beyond her years. She was holding it all together, just like Ruth. "Good," Ruth said, turning back to her laptop. "We don't want any surprises." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them staring at the screen. Katie's fingers idly tapped the edge of the desk, as if processing everything that had unfolded in the past few days. Ruth could feel the weight of what was coming, the final moments, the last few pieces of a puzzle that had been years in the making. But before Ruth could speak again, her phone buzzed on the desk beside her. The screen lit up with a notification, a new post from Jenna. Ruth frowned, picking up the phone without hesitation. She opened the Facebook app, the first words of Jenna's post glaring at her from the screen. "Being betrayed by blood is the worst." Ruth stared at the words for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. It was exactly what she expected. Jenna had always been dramatic, always quick to spin her side of the story to make herself the victim. Ruth knew it wouldn't be long before Mason, too, would start spinning things in his own favor, blaming her for everything. But Ruth wasn't fooled. She had done what was necessary, what was right, and the rest was up to them. The post was getting attention fast. Ruth scrolled through the comments, some from close friends, others from strangers, all falling into two categories: those who sympathized with Jenna's betrayal and those who sided with Ruth, some even offering their own quiet words of support. Ruth knew that public opinion didn't matter. What mattered was the law, and she had it on her side. Katie glanced over at Ruth, watching her grandmother's unreadable expression. "What are you going to do now?" she asked, her voice soft. Ruth set the phone down, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. "Nothing. I've done enough." There was a long silence. Katie's gaze softened, and Ruth felt a quiet sense of pride in her granddaughter. Katie was more than just a silent observer. She was part of this, part of the process, part of the family that Ruth was now protecting at all costs. As Ruth stood up from her desk, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. Everything was in place. The legal groundwork was set, the evidence was secure, and the video, the proof of everything that had led to this point, was safely stored in the cloud, just waiting for the next move. Jenna's post would get her attention. Mason's pleading would likely continue, but none of it would change the truth. Ruth had already made her choice, and no amount of social media posts or shouting would take it away. Ruth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. She knew that the next few weeks would bring more drama, more noise, but for now, she could finally breathe. She had done what needed to be done, and nothing, not even Jenna's empty threats, could change that. Ruth was sitting on the patio when Mason and Jenna approached. It was a warm evening, the kind of early spring night that could have almost felt like a fresh start. The table before her was set with a simple dinner, the plates untouched, the air still heavy with the weight of what had transpired earlier that day. The house was quiet, and yet it felt full, full of unanswered questions, simmering emotions, and the faintest trace of regret. She didn't look up immediately as Mason and Jenna approached. She let them come to her, as if it was some small act of control in a situation where so much had already been taken from them. "Mom." "Ruth." Mason's voice had an edge to it, a quiet, pleading tone that was still laced with uncertainty. Jenna's footsteps behind him were much more deliberate, sharp, like every move she made was calculated, controlled. She knew how to wear her anger like a mask. Mason cleared his throat. Standing a few feet away from her, his hands stuffed in his pockets, Jenna flanked him, arms crossed, her face a mix of tension and something else, something Ruth didn't have the patience to analyze anymore. "We need to talk," Mason said, almost too carefully, privately. Ruth sat still, not responding immediately. She didn't need to give them a response, didn't need to rush into anything. She was the one in control now, and they knew it. They were here to fix things, but they couldn't undo what had already been done. The lines were drawn. "Sit down," Ruth said quietly, motioning to the chairs opposite her. "Let's talk." Mason sat first, his posture stiff, like a man trying to carry the weight of something he didn't fully understand. Jenna hesitated before sitting beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze never quite meeting Ruth's. A few seconds passed. The silence between them felt deliberate, as if they were trying to figure out how to play their next move. Finally, Jenna broke the quiet. I'm sorry for what happened," she began, her voice far softer than usual, almost apologetic. But there was no warmth to her words. Ruth could feel the lack of sincerity radiating off her. This wasn't an apology. It was a script. Jenna's eyes darted to Mason, then back to Ruth. "I'm under stress," she continued, her tone flat but calculated. That slap was out of character. It wasn't me. Ruth could almost hear the words she wanted to say, the accusations, the raw emotion she had been holding back for weeks. But instead, she just leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching them closely. She had already made up her mind about what this was. It was nothing but damage control, a carefully rehearsed attempt to save face, to repair the little they still thought they had. Mason followed up quickly, his words coming a little too fast. "We can all move forward, right? I mean, this is just a misunderstanding, right?" His eyes locked with Ruth's, pleading for something, anything. Ruth stayed silent for a long moment, her gaze steady. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, her posture relaxed but firm. She wasn't going to rush this, not now. She wasn't going to make it easy for them. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, almost calm. "Say that again," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "For the camera." Mason froze. For a second, he didn't know what she meant. But then, his eyes shifted toward the small, unobtrusive phone resting on the table in front of them, the screen still on, recording. The realization hit him hard, the blood draining from his face. Jenna's mouth tightened, her eyes flicking from Ruth to Mason, then back at the phone. The silence stretched out between them like a taut wire. "You're recording this?" Jenna snapped, the mask of calm slipping for a moment. Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to. The phone sat there, steady, capturing the moment, capturing their faces, their words. This was part of the process now. The law, the proof, the record of their actions. It didn't matter what they said anymore. Ruth had already won. This was just their last act of desperation. "Say it again," Ruth repeated, her voice as cold as the wine in her glass. She wasn't angry. No, she wasn't angry at all. This was business, pure and simple. Mason's eyes darted to Jenna, and there was something in his expression now. A flicker of fear, of knowing that this wasn't a simple apology anymore. They had gone too far, and Ruth wasn't backing down. Jenna's lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. She had no more excuses, no more defenses. Mason's hand twitched, as if he wanted to stop this, but he couldn't. Not now. Not anymore. The camera caught the moment, the final, damning silence. And Ruth, her gaze unwavering, finally allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was over. The house was hers, and soon they would know it too. The sun was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the patio. Ruth sat at the table, her hands folded calmly in front of her, the cool glass of wine in front of her half empty. The evening was peaceful, almost serene. But it was a peace she'd earned through quiet resolve, not through compromise. The gentle rustling of the trees and the distant hum of neighborhood sounds seemed far away now, out of reach. There was no more pretending, no more peace to be found in her house. Mason and Jenna approached, but Ruth didn't move. She didn't have to. She knew what they were here for. A last-ditch effort to save face, to right a wrong they had never truly acknowledged. They had nothing left, but they would still try. Mason walked in first, his face set in a strange combination of guilt and pride, like someone who had been caught in the middle of something they had no control over. Jenna followed, her posture rigid, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She was trying, as usual, to hold herself together, to pretend like she hadn't just exploded in fury earlier that day. They both stopped in front of her, and the silence that stretched between them felt thick, almost suffocating. Ruth didn't look up at them. She just waited. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice soft but strained. "Ruth, we need to talk." His eyes darted briefly to Jenna and then back to Ruth, as though seeking permission for this conversation that he hoped would somehow undo everything that had happened. Ruth didn't respond immediately. She simply gestured to the empty chairs across from her, her movement deliberate. "Sit." They both hesitated but eventually complied, sitting down across from her. The tension was palpable, Mason fidgeting with his hands, Jenna tapping her fingers impatiently on her knee. "Look," Jenna started. the words coming out slowly as if she were carefully selecting each one. I'm sorry for what happened. I don't know what got into me. The stress, the pressure, it just all built up. Ruth didn't move, didn't react. She knew it was coming, knew that this was what they would offer. A carefully rehearsed apology, a facade of contrition that didn't even begin to scrape the surface of what had actually happened. Jenna continued, her voice faltering slightly now. The slap, I never should have done that. It's just, everything's been out of control lately, and that was out of character. Ruth remained silent. She didn't need to say anything. Jenna's words were meaningless without accountability. She wasn't listening for remorse. She was waiting for something real. But Jenna wasn't capable of real. Not anymore. Mason took over, speaking faster now, as if afraid to lose Ruth's attention. We want to fix this. We can all move forward, right? I mean, we're family. You don't want this to end like this, do you? His words seemed to tumble out, almost frantic, as if he were trying to pull her back into the lie they had been living. Ruth's eyes flicked toward him, her gaze steady and unwavering. She had heard enough. Say that again, Ruth said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying the weight of something much larger than just this moment. She wasn't going to let them make it easy. Not now. Mason froze, blinking at her, unsure of what she meant. His mouth opened and closed, and Jenna's brow furrowed in confusion. Ruth leaned forward slightly, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. Say that again, she repeated, her eyes sharp now, focused, for the camera. It took a moment, but the realization hit both of them like a slap in the face. They looked down at the table where Ruth's phone lay, screen illuminated, recording. Jenna's face flushed, her lips pressing tightly together as she realized what Ruth had done. You're recording this? She asked, her voice strained, almost accusatory. Ruth didn't answer. She simply gestured to the phone again. Mason's face twisted in disbelief. He glanced at Jenna, who was now looking anywhere but at Ruth, and then back at the phone. The camera, an inanimate object that had caught the rawness of their reality, their final plea, was now a symbol of the truth that they couldn't escape. Say it, Ruth said softly, her voice almost a whisper now. But it was a whisper that held everything. Jenna opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Mason's eyes shifted from Ruth to the phone and back again. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat, his mouth dry. This wasn't what he had expected. He thought this would be easy. He thought they could sweep everything under the rug just like they always had. But Ruth wasn't going to let them. Jenna muttered something under her breath, something Ruth couldn't catch. And then, finally, Mason looked down at the table, defeated. He cleared his throat, and in a quiet, almost broken voice said, We're sorry. I'm sorry. We just want things to go back to normal. Ruth watched them both carefully. The apology wasn't real. It couldn't be. Not after everything they'd done. And she knew. Deep down, they knew it too. This wasn't going to fix anything. Nothing could. The silence between them was thick, heavier than any words could ever be. Finally, Ruth picked up the phone, sliding it into her pocket. 30 days, she said, standing up. Pack your things. After that, you're gone. She didn't wait for them to respond. She didn't need to. The decision had been made. And as she turned to walk inside, leaving them frozen on the patio, Ruth allowed herself a single, final breath of relief. There would be no more pretending, no more lies. Everything was finally falling into place. The first whispers reached Ruth on a Tuesday afternoon. The phone rang as she was finishing up a quiet lunch. Just a salad, a little bread, nothing fancy. The sound of the ringtone cut through the stillness of the house, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, It was Carol, one of the neighbors. Ruth had known Carol for years, and if there was anything worth knowing about the neighborhood, Carol knew it first. Ruth, Carol's voice came through the line, low and concerned. Have you heard what Jenna's been saying? Ruth's lips tightened, but she didn't let her expression shift. Not yet, Carol. What's she saying? Oh, Carol said, her voice dripping with the kind of gossip that had always flowed easily through their community. She's been talking about the eviction, telling everyone at yoga that you're trying to take everything from them. She's spinning it like you're the villain in all this. The HOA meeting last night was full of it. She's making it sound like you're, I don't know, trying to take over the neighborhood. Ruth's grip on the phone tightened slightly, but she remained still. This was exactly what she'd expected. Jenna wasn't one to take a loss gracefully. She was probably telling everyone that Ruth was the one who'd started the war, the one who'd escalated things. Thanks for the heads up, Carol. I appreciate it, Ruth said, her tone flat but steady. I'll handle it. Of course, Ruth. But just so you know, Carol's voice lowered to a whisper, she's making people choose sides. The HOA members are starting to, well, they're not all on your side. Some of them are starting to listen to her. I just thought you should know. Ruth's gaze wandered out the kitchen window, watching the sun cast long shadows on the lawn. She could almost hear the drama playing out just outside her door. Jenna, no doubt, was spinning her tale with all the fervor of a woman who thought the world owed her something. Thank you, Carol, Ruth repeated, her voice measured. I'll take care of it. The conversation ended soon after, but the tension didn't leave. Instead, it grew, a quiet hum at the back of Ruth's mind as she thought about what came next. If Jenna was going to turn the neighborhood against her, Ruth needed to take control of the narrative. She needed to make sure the truth was known, loud and clear. That afternoon, Ruth called a few of her longtime neighbors, people she knew she could trust, people who had been there long enough to understand the dynamic. Carol had been one voice, but Ruth needed more. She invited them over, 3 of the closest: Susan, Rebecca, and Emily. They had lived here for decades, had seen the highs and lows of neighborhood life, and they knew, better than anyone, the way things were truly happening behind closed doors. When they arrived, Ruth didn't waste time with pleasantries. She led them to the living room, where the faint scent of lavender still lingered in the air from the candles she had lit earlier. The house was quiet, almost too quiet now that the conflict had escalated. Ruth sat them down, her expression resolute. I'm not going to let her destroy what's left, Ruth said simply, opening her laptop. I have the footage. She clicked a few keys and the video appeared on the screen, a raw, unfiltered record of Jenna's outburst. Ruth had already uploaded it to a secure cloud account, but now she played it for her neighbors, each of them watching in silence as the slap landed, the venom in Jenna's voice clear as day. Susan gasped. Rebecca's face darkened. Emily looked like she might say something, but all she did was nod slowly. Jenna needs to be held accountable, Ruth said after a moment, her voice low. And I'm not going to let her spin this into something it isn't. The truth is here. And I have every intention of making sure people know it. They nodded. All 3 of them. Susan was the first to speak, her voice steady. Ruth, we've known you for years. This isn't you. We've seen Jenna's side of things. But this is something else. Rebecca leaned in, her eyes narrowing. She's been stirring up trouble at the HOA meetings, but we've all seen the truth now. We'll back you, Ruth. You've got it. Emily spoke next, her voice calm and measured. I'll help spread the word. People need to know what's really going on here. Ruth felt a small weight lift off her shoulders. It was enough to turn the tide, at least here. She couldn't control Jenna's story, but she could control her own. A few days later, the rumor mill was in full swing. Ruth watched, detached, as Jenna's influence began to falter. The same people who had been quick to nod in agreement at Jenna's story began pulling away. At book club, Jenna's attempts to garner sympathy were met with cool responses. Her charm fell flat. The cold shoulders from her friends were more effective than Ruth could have hoped for. Meanwhile, Katie had been helping Ruth draft a brief note to the HOA, something short and to the point. Just the facts, as Ruth put it. No drama. No accusations. Just the clear, unassailable truth of what had transpired. Katie added the final touches, and Ruth signed it. With everything ready, Ruth sealed the envelope and walked out to the mailbox, her movements deliberate. She placed the letter inside and closed the door with a quiet finality. The HOA would get the truth, documented and irrefutable. Ruth didn't need to say another word. Everything was already in motion. It was the morning of day 29, the last day they were allowed to be in the house, and already, Ruth could feel the subtle weight of silence in the air. There was a sense of finality, a quiet, unspoken agreement between the walls and the earth beneath her feet that this chapter was coming to an end. The moving boxes appeared in the hallway like a slow tide creeping across the floor. There was no urgency in Mason's movements, just the methodical, almost mechanical way he packed, as though he were trying to avoid confronting what was really happening. His hands worked quickly, but his eyes never met Ruth's. She could hear the faint rustling of paper as he packed his clothes, the soft thud of items being dropped into boxes, but the room itself seemed to hold its breath. He'd come down from upstairs earlier that morning, looking like he hadn't slept, like he was carrying something heavy inside him. But whatever thoughts he had, Ruth could tell he wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. He just avoided her gaze, his movements stiff, as if he were somehow still expecting something to change, still hoping that this was just a bad dream he could wake up from. Across from him, Jenna's anger had only grown. Her actions were fast, wild. Things were being thrown into bags with an unrestrained fury. There was no grace in it, only the sharp, rapid motion of someone who felt everything slipping away. Jenna's lips were curled in a sneer as she muttered insults under her breath, but Ruth knew better than to listen. The words weren't for her. They were for herself, for the quiet storm of frustration that Jenna couldn't stop, even as it boiled over. Ruth didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The sound of Jenna's muttering and Mason's quiet packing were enough to fill the space between them, to fill the house that had been home for so many years. After a while, Ruth rose from the chair by the kitchen window where she had been sitting, her eyes lingering on the scene before her. She had known this day would come, and though it wasn't easy, she was ready. She walked into the kitchen and filled a glass of water, placing it gently on the table beside Mason. "You want some water?" Ruth asked, her voice steady but unyielding. There was no bitterness in it, no sarcasm. Just the quiet finality of offering them the bare minimum. Mason paused for a moment, his eyes flicking up to meet hers, but he didn't say anything. He just nodded, slowly, as if he didn't know how to respond. His fingers wrapped around the glass, but his grip was loose, distracted. It felt almost like an apology in that gesture, a small, silent admission of the weight he carried. But Ruth wasn't waiting for apologies anymore. Jenna, on the other hand, didn't even look up when Ruth entered. She was too busy throwing things into a trash bag, her movements sharp, almost violent. There was no softness left in her. Not now. The person Ruth had known for years was long gone, replaced by someone who was angry, desperate to keep her grip on what she thought was hers. Ruth didn't try to talk to her. Jenna wasn't interested in hearing anything she had to say. Instead, Ruth moved quietly toward the stairs, her eyes glancing up at Katie's bedroom window. Her granddaughter had been watching from above, eyes peeking through the blinds, her presence a silent observation. Ruth could feel Katie's gaze on her, though she couldn't see her face. It wasn't the kind of thing Katie needed to see up close. The finality of this moment was enough for both of them. The day wore on. Mason's packing became slower, more deliberate. He'd filled the first few boxes, but now he seemed lost in his own thoughts. Jenna was still at it, throwing things around with a mix of frustration and anger. At one point, Ruth heard her yell something, though the words were lost in the rush of motion. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the next step. The house was almost empty, and with every item that disappeared into a box, it became less and less theirs. By the time night fell, Ruth was standing by the front door, her hands still folded behind her back, her posture relaxed. The movers were scheduled for the morning, and she didn't want to be there when they arrived. There would be no need for her to watch them cart away the last of Jenna and Mason's belongings. This part was done. As she stood there, the weight of the past month settled over her. There had been so many battles. Silent, loud, messy. But she had weathered them all. The silence was louder now than the shouting ever had been. She didn't feel victorious. She just felt calm, peaceful even. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see the movers, their trucks parked in the driveway, ready to do what had to be done. Ruth didn't wave. There was nothing to say, nothing left to prove. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching as they carried the first box out of the house. Her house. It was a strange, quiet relief. And as the last box disappeared through the door, Ruth closed it behind them, locking it with a finality that felt like the end of a long, difficult chapter. No words were needed. No further moves. It was done. The house had never been so quiet. Not in the mornings, not in the evenings, and certainly not after the chaos had swept through. The dust from the past few weeks had finally settled, but Ruth could still feel its weight in the corners of every room. It wasn't just the belongings that had been packed and moved away. It was the lives that had been lived here, the tension that had crept into the walls, the whispered words, the slammed doors. All of it had left a mark. But now, the house was hers again. Ruth stood at the foot of the stairs, a bucket of cleaning supplies at her feet. The list of things to do stretched out in her mind. Things she had been waiting to do for months, years. She didn't rush this time. The house was quiet, and the silence felt like a reward, not an emptiness. It was something she had fought for, something she had earned. And now it was time to take it back, room by room. The guest suite was first. Ruth started with the bed, remaking it with fresh linens, the soft smell of lavender drifting up as she smoothed the blankets into place. The scent was subtle, gentle. The room had once been a haven for Jenna, full of the noise and clutter of someone trying to claim what wasn't theirs. Now it was hers to reclaim. A fresh start. Ruth opened the closet doors and examined the space, moving the small dresser aside. She found the remnants of Jenna's presents, an old yoga mat stuffed in the back corner, a bottle of wine tucked behind a row of shoes. It was like unearthing old remnants, things that didn't belong. Ruth didn't linger on them. She simply gathered them up and placed them in a bag for donation. It felt almost meditative, clearing away the old to make room for what was truly hers. Katie came down the stairs then, her movements quiet but purposeful. She had been silent most of the morning, watching her grandmother work. Ruth could feel her presence in the doorway before she even looked up. "Need help?" Katie asked, her voice soft but steady. Ruth glanced at her granddaughter, meeting her eyes with a faint smile. There was a quiet strength in Katie now, a confidence Ruth had seen blossom over the past few weeks. She had seen how Katie had quietly taken on her role in the house, how she had stood by Ruth when it mattered. And now, as Ruth moved from one room to the next, Katie was right there beside her, ready to help in ways that only a granddaughter could. I'd love some help, Ruth replied, her voice steady. Let's take care of this room together. Katie stepped forward, picking up a brush. She was precise as she helped Ruth repaint the walls a calming shade of blue. The strokes were deliberate, slow, and measured. As the color settled into place, the room transformed. The old, aggressive energy that had filled the space seemed to fade with every brush stroke, replaced by something lighter, something peaceful. They worked together, side by side, quietly painting the room, layer by layer until the walls were rich and smooth. The space that had once been filled with tension was now suffused with calm. Ruth stood back, taking in the finished room. It's perfect, Katie said, stepping back with her hands on her hips. It feels different, better. Ruth nodded, a quiet sense of satisfaction washing over her. It's ours now, Katie. Completely. The next task was the shelves. Ruth had been planning to redo the corner where Jenna's vanity had once sat, taking up far more space than it deserved. Ruth and Katie spent the next hour building a set of simple wooden shelves. Nothing too extravagant, just something functional and clean. It was the kind of task Ruth had always enjoyed. The small satisfaction of creating something useful, something that belonged in its space. As they worked, Katie held the hammer steady, nails lining up perfectly, and Ruth couldn't help but feel a growing sense of peace between them. When the shelves were finished, Ruth stepped back and surveyed the work. Everything was in its place now. Nothing felt out of balance. The wine rack in the dining room came next. Ruth pulled out the few bottles she had kept, a selection of better labels. She carefully replaced the dusty, forgotten bottles that had once been hidden behind Jenna's overpriced collection. Ruth smiled to herself, a small, satisfied chuckle escaping her lips. This was her house again, and now everything had its rightful place. By late afternoon, Ruth decided to bake. The smell of cinnamon bread filled the house, the warm scent weaving its way through every room. The kitchen had always been a place of comfort for Ruth. Quiet, warm, and steady. She kneaded the dough with care, letting the routine of it soothe her. She had learned long ago that bread, like life, was something you had to take time with. The quiet hum of the oven seemed to punctuate the stillness in the house. Katie came into the kitchen, the faintest smile on her lips. She took a deep breath as the bread began to rise. It smells amazing in here. Ruth smiled, wiping her hands on the towel. It's the peace we've earned. The evening drew on, and Ruth lit a candle on the dining room table. It was one of the few things she had kept after the chaos. The soft, flickering light of a candle always made things feel still, calm, whole. She sat down at the table with Katie, both of them sharing a quiet dinner together. The house was no longer full of noise and tension. It was full of peace. And Ruth finally let herself rest in it. The silence wasn't something to fear anymore. It was earned, deserved. It was her peace now, and no one could take it from her. The lawyer's office had always felt like a place where things were settled, a space where final decisions were made, where the future was put in ink and bound by law. Ruth had been here before, years ago, when her husband had passed, when the house had first been placed in her name. But this time she didn't feel the same uncertainty, the hesitation she'd once felt. Today was different. Today she was here to ensure that everything was locked down, that her decisions would stand, not just for now, but for the future. The office was small but well lit. Light poured through the tall windows, spilling across the polished wooden desk and the rows of leather-bound books that lined the shelves. Darla Wynne, her estate attorney, sat behind the desk, her face calm and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos Ruth had just come through. Darla didn't waste time on pleasantries. She slid the thick folder in front of Ruth, already open to the section marked Will and Testament. Ruth's hands rested lightly on the desk, her fingers curling around the pages as she looked up at Darla. "I need it finalized," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm done leaving things to chance." Darla's eyes narrowed slightly as she nodded, already aware of the gravity in Ruth's voice. "I know you've been through a lot, Ruth. We've gone over your wishes already. But now, we'll make sure everything is clear, locked in. We'll get it right." Ruth nodded. She'd been waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, she could feel the weight of it settling on her shoulders. The past weeks had been about cleansing, about creating a space that was hers, truly hers again. But this was the final step. Darla continued. "I've made sure that your estate will be fully protected. The house will be placed in a trust, irrevocable, so there's no room for anyone to challenge it. No one can take it from you now." She glanced at Ruth, her voice softening just slightly. "Not even Mason and Jenna." Ruth's gaze never wavered. "No one," she repeated. Her voice was low, but there was no doubt in it. "I don't want them to have any part of it. Not anymore." Darla paused for a moment, then began filling in the details. "We'll list Katie as your primary beneficiary," she said, looking up at Ruth. "She'll inherit everything. All rights to the property, once the time comes. The trust will ensure she has full access, no interference. Mason and Jenna are removed from every clause, every provision. They won't be able to touch anything." Ruth let out a slow breath, a flicker of relief passing through her. "They don't get to live in what they tried to destroy," she said, her voice firm, but there was an edge to it now. "I've worked too hard, and I won't let them ruin it." Darla nodded, typing a few things into her laptop. "It's all taken care of, Ruth. Once we sign, it'll be done. No one can change it. No one can contest it." Ruth's hands tightened around the folder as she thought about the last few months, the arguments, the chaos, the years of being pushed aside. Jenna had always seen Ruth's home as a prize, as something to be claimed, but Ruth had never been one to back down. The house had been built with love, with sweat, and with the promise of a life that belonged to her, and only her. She glanced at Darla, who had already turned to the last page of the document, ready for Ruth's signature. Darla slid the pen across the desk. "This is it," Darla said, her voice steady. "Once you sign, it's all set. Everything will be protected. The house, the trust. It's yours." Ruth didn't hesitate. Her fingers closed around the pen, her grip firm, deliberate. With one smooth motion, she signed her name, the ink setting her future in place. Darla took the document, her fingers flipping through the pages one last time. "All set," she said, smiling faintly. "The house, the trust, everything is legally bound. You're done." Ruth leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting out the window. Outside, the sky was overcast, a faint drizzle beginning to fall. But inside, everything felt different. The air was clear. The weight had been lifted. It was done. Ruth exhaled slowly, feeling the finality of the decision wrap around her like a blanket. For the first time in what felt like years, she was truly free. The house was hers, and now, so was her future. "You'll be all right, Ruth," Darla said, glancing at her over the rim of her glasses. "You've protected what matters." Ruth nodded. "I know," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I've earned this peace." And as she left the office, the drizzle outside seeming to soften with every step she took. Ruth felt something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of true security. The future was hers, and no one could take it away. The email came on a Tuesday morning, the subject line simple, almost innocent in its request. "We've changed. Can we visit?" Ruth stared at the screen for a long moment, her fingers resting on the keyboard. She didn't need to read it again. She knew exactly what it meant. Jenna's words had a familiar tone, an attempt to rewrite the story, to soften the edges of their earlier conflict, to reclaim some form of access, some part of Ruth's life that had slipped from her grasp. Ruth sat back in her chair, the weight of the message hanging in the air like smoke. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew what was at stake. Instead, she printed it out. The click of the printer broke the silence, and she watched the paper slide into the tray, Jenna's words now in black and white, permanently recorded. Ruth glanced at the sheet for a moment longer, then calmly slid it into a folder labeled Nerve. She didn't need to waste any more energy on it. The silence in the house felt rich now, like an old memory that had been carefully preserved. Ruth's steps were light as she walked from the office, her eyes glancing across the hallway to the kitchen where the soft hum of activity greeted her. The house was bathed in morning light, warm and inviting. The sound of music floated from the kitchen, something jazzy, relaxed, a far cry from the clamor that had once dominated these rooms. Katie was at the kitchen counter, her back to the door, preparing a breakfast of pancakes. Ruth watched her for a moment, taking in the peaceful rhythm of her granddaughter's movements. There was no sense of tension here, no more drama, just the quiet buzz of ordinary, beautiful life. The sound of a plate being set down on the counter snapped Ruth back to the present. Katie turned, her eyes lighting up at the sight of her grandmother. "Morning, Grandma," she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Morning, sweetheart," Ruth replied, her voice steady, but there was warmth in it now, something that had been absent in the past. The tension that had once filled the space between them had evaporated, replaced by something richer, something that felt like home. Ruth walked over to the counter and took a seat beside Katie, glancing at the pancakes, the syrup, the small cups of fruit arranged with care. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. There was something about the stillness of the house, the way the light moved through the windows, the way the kitchen smelled, so different from the chaos that had once been. Ruth felt a deep, quiet peace settle over her as she watched Katie continue to move with purpose, humming to herself, as if everything had finally come into its place. Ruth smiled softly to herself. She was finally at peace with it all. As the minutes passed, Ruth found herself moving to the drawer where she had kept the spare keys, the keys to the house that had once been a symbol of ownership, a thing to be held tightly, protected. She opened the drawer slowly, taking the single key in her hand. She held it for a moment, feeling its cool, familiar weight. And then, without hesitation, she walked over to where Katie was standing, still in the midst of flipping pancakes, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Ruth held the key out to Katie. The quiet moment between them stretched, unspoken but understood. Katie looked up, her eyes meeting Ruth's for just a moment before she reached for the key. Her fingers brushed against Ruth's, and Ruth let the key slip into her granddaughter's hand, placing it there without fanfare, without hesitation. "It's yours now," Ruth said softly, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of everything that had come before. "You never made me feel unwelcome. This is your home too." Katie's face softened, her smile growing a little wider as she took the key, her fingers curling around it as if it were a promise. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't have to. Her gratitude, her understanding, was written in the way she held the key, the way she stood a little straighter in that quiet moment. Ruth stepped back, taking a breath, feeling the finality of it all. This was the new beginning, the one that Jenna and Mason had never understood, and perhaps never would. They had pushed her to this point. They had underestimated her strength. But Katie had always understood. As Ruth turned to leave the kitchen, her hand brushed over the counter, a light touch, a reminder that everything was in its place now. No more interruptions, no more chaos. Just peace. Just home. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her robe as she walked into the living room. a small chime that pulled her out of the calm. She glanced at the screen. Jenna, please, I need to see you. Ruth looked at the message, her thumb hovering over the delete button. She didn't even read the rest of it. There was no need. With a final, deliberate motion, she pressed the button. Gone. The past was truly behind her now. My daughter-in-law slapped me and screamed for my keys. She didn't realize the locks had already changed.